The morning Cornelius Fletcher buried his father, he did not yet know that within the year he would sell off everything the old man had built, down to the silver watch chain, just to unlock the leg irons of 40 men he had never met. Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1873, smelled of cattle dust and fresh-cut pine, and the wind that came down from the plains carried the sound of the railroad yard where cattle bawled and drovers shouted their last curses of the drive. Cornelius stood at the edge of the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, his black coat too heavy for the warming air, and watched the clods of Kansas earth fall onto his father's coffin. Amos Fletcher had been a hard man, a cattle broker who had clawed his way from nothing to owning 3,000 acres of grazing land and a herd that numbered in the thousands, and he had left every bit of it to his only son. Cornelius was 26 years old, tall and broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, a pale hazel green that seemed to hold more sorrow than a young man ought to carry. He had his father's height, but not his father's temperament, for where Amos had been ruthless in business and cold in his affections, Cornelius had grown into a man who could not walk past a beggar without emptying his pockets, who once gave his own coat to a freezing drifter outside the drover's cottage hotel and walked home in his shirt-sleeves through a Kansas winter. It was 3 weeks after the funeral that he first heard of the debt peonage camps. He had ridden south into the Indian Territory to settle an old contract of his father's, a matter of grazing rights that needed a signature, and it was there, along the Red River near a settlement called Preston, that he came upon a labor camp run by a man named Silas Prout. Prout held contracts, so he claimed, on nearly 50 men, most of them freedmen who had been sharecroppers before falling into debt, and a scattering of Mexican laborers who had crossed north looking for wage work and found instead a system as cruel as anything they had fled. The men worked from Kansas to Kansas cutting timber and clearing brush for a railroad spur that was being pushed through the territory, and they were paid in scrip that could only be spent at Prout's own commissary, at prices so inflated that no man could ever work off what he supposedly owed. Cornelius had heard of such arrangements before, in whispered conversations among cattlemen who thought them merely shrewd business, but he had never seen one with his own eyes until he rode past the camp on his way back north and saw a boy no older than 15 collapse in the heat, only to be kicked upright by an overseer with a leather quirt. He did not sleep that night. He lay in his bedroll under the cottonwoods along the Red River and stared up at a sky thick with stars, and he thought of his father, who had built his fortune trading cattle bought cheap from men desperate enough to sell below market, who had once told Cornelius that sentiment had no place in a ledger book. Cornelius had inherited that ledger book, and every dollar written in it, and he decided before the sun rose that he would spend every one of those dollars if it meant tearing down what he had seen. He rode into Preston at first light and found the land office, and there he learned that Silas Prout's claim on the men was not entirely a fiction of violence, but was tangled in real paper, debts sold and resold, contracts with the railroad company, liens filed against the labor itself as though men were livestock to be mortgaged. It was a business, cold and legal in the way his father's business had been legal, and Cornelius understood that he could not simply ride in with a gun and free the men, for Prout had 6 armed guards and friends among the local marshals who took a cut of the profits. He would have to buy the men free, contract by contract, the same way his father had once bought and sold cattle. It took him 4 days of hard riding and harder talking to track down the actual holder of the debts, a banking concern out of Fort Worth that had extended credit to Prout against the labor contracts as collateral. The banker, a thin man named Whitlock with ink-stained fingers and no apparent conscience, was delighted to sell the paper outright rather than wait on Prout's slow repayments, and Cornelius signed away $11,000 of his father's estate, nearly a third of everything Amos Fletcher had left him, for a stack of documents that named 43 men by name and declared their debts satisfied. Prout did not take the news well. Cornelius returned to the camp with the banker's release papers and 2 men he had hired in Preston as witnesses, a blacksmith named Otis Greer and a retired army sergeant called Dunmore who had lost 2 fingers at Chickamauga and had no patience left in him for cruelty. Prout met them on the porch of his commissary with a shotgun across his knees and told Cornelius that paper or no paper, those men owed him for their keep, their tools, their very breath if he cared to bill them for it. "The debts are satisfied," Cornelius said, keeping his voice level though his heart hammered against his ribs. "I bought the paper from Whitlock's bank. Every dollar these men owe, I now own, and I am forgiving it. You have no more claim on them than you have on me." "You are a fool boy playing at charity," Prout spat, "and you will find these woods are far from any law that cares what a Fort Worth banker signs." It was Dunmore who stepped forward then, his ruined hand resting easy near his belt, and said in a voice gone flat with old soldiering that he had seen men like Prout before, men who mistook cruelty for strength, and that he would be glad to demonstrate the difference if Prout cared to raise that shotgun another inch. The standoff held for a long, breathless moment, the only sound the creak of the commissary sign swinging on its chain, until one of Prout's own guards, a young man named Riley who had been fed on the same watery beans as the prisoners, lowered his rifle and said he wanted no part of shooting a man over paperwork he half suspected was already true. Prout's resolve crumbled without his men behind him. He took the money Cornelius offered, a further $2,000 to simply walk away and never file another claim against a soul in that camp, and by sundown 43 men stood free in a clearing by the Red River, some weeping, some silent with a shock too deep for tears. One old freedman named Josiah Bell falling to his knees in the dirt and pressing his forehead to the ground as though the earth itself had granted him mercy. Word of what Cornelius Fletcher had done spread through the territory faster than he could have imagined, carried by freedmen themselves as they scattered toward kin and toward new lives, carried by drummers and drovers who told the tale in saloons from Denison to Wichita, growing a little taller with every telling, until some versions had Cornelius shooting Prout dead in the street, which was not true, though Cornelius did not much mind the exaggeration if it meant more such camps might tremble at his name. He was not finished. Within 2 months he had learned of another camp near the Kishom Crossing, this one holding 20 men under a labor contractor named Beauchamp, and Cornelius spent another $4,000 unwinding that man's paper as well. By autumn he had freed better than 80 men across 3 different camps, and his father's fortune, once counted in the tens of thousands, had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. His remaining ranch hands began to whisper that young Fletcher had gone soft in the head with grief, that he meant to beggar himself over strangers who owed him nothing and would give him nothing in return. His father's old business partners in Abilene, men like Harmon Ridge who had once slapped Amos Fletcher on the back at cattle auctions, now crossed the street rather than speak to the son who was, in their eyes, squandering a good Kansas fortune on the troubles of men who were none of his concern. Cornelius heard the whispers and did not much care. He had seen the boy kicked upright by the quirt, and he had seen Josiah Bell weeping into the Red River dirt, and no amount of Abilene gossip could weigh against those 2 memories. It was in November of that year, with the first hard frost silvering the grass around his diminished ranch house, that he received a letter which would change the course of everything that followed. It came from a woman named Fannie Carter, writing from a town called Larned further west along the Arkansas River, and it was not a letter of gratitude nor of gossip, but a plea for help, written in a strong, clear hand that betrayed both education and desperation in equal measure. Fannie Carter was 24 years old that autumn, a schoolteacher's daughter who had herself taken up teaching when her father passed of the influenza 3 winters before, leaving her alone in Larned with a small house, a shelf of borrowed books, and a fierce, quiet courage that the town had come to respect even as it puzzled over why so handsome and capable a woman remained unmarried. She had dark hair she wore in a braid coiled at her neck, eyes the deep brown of good coffee, and a spray of freckles across her nose that she had always considered a childish flaw, and that every man who ever truly looked at her considered otherwise. She had turned down 2 proposals in the past year alone, one from a cattle buyer who wanted a wife to keep his house and raise his children, and never asked what Fannie herself wanted from a marriage, and another from the town's young doctor who was kind enough but whose kindness felt to Fannie like a still pond rather than a running river, safe but somehow lifeless. The trouble that drove Fannie to write to a stranger had begun 3 months earlier, when her younger brother Thomas, only 19 years old and reckless in the way of young men who have never yet been humbled by the world, had taken work with a freight outfit running supplies down toward the Texas Panhandle. The outfit's owner, a man named Garrett Voss, ran his teamsters much as Prout had run his lumbermen, advancing wages against debts for food and equipment that could never be paid down. And when Thomas had tried to quit after discovering the trap he was in, Voss had produced papers claiming Thomas owed him for a wagon axle broken on the trail, for feed for the mules, for 100 small charges that added up to more than a year's wages. Voss held Thomas now at a way station south of Dodge City, working him alongside a dozen other trapped teamsters, and had sent word to Fannie that her brother would remain in his debt, and in his camp, until the sum was settled in full, a sum that grew, it seemed, every month Fannie failed to produce it. She had heard of Cornelius Fletcher the way half the territory had heard of him, through a traveling preacher who had passed through Larned and spoken from the pulpit of a rich man's son, who had given away his fortune to free the enslaved of the modern age. Debt slaves though they were rather than the chattel slavery so recently ended by war. Fannie had written to him that same night, her hand trembling with a hope she was almost afraid to feel, asking not for charity but for help, for she had heard he did not simply give money away but went himself, rode into these camps and faced these men down. Cornelius read her letter twice by lamplight in his father's old study, a room he had not fully made his own even a year after Amos's death, and something in the plain, desperate honesty of her words struck him harder than any of the tales of cruelty he had already witnessed. Perhaps it was that she asked for her brother by name, Thomas Carter, 19 years old, a good boy who had only wanted honest work. Perhaps it was simply that her handwriting, careful and strong even in distress, made her feel real to him in a way that the abstract suffering of strangers sometimes did not. Whatever the reason, he saddled his horse the next morning and rode west toward Larned with barely $6,000 left to his name, and a determination that this, whatever it cost him, would not be a debt he refused to pay. The ride to Larned took the better part of 4 days, following the Arkansas River west through country that grew steadily drier and more open, the tall grass of eastern Kansas giving way to shorter buffalo grass, and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking a creek bed. Cornelius rode a sturdy bay gelding named Samson, a horse his father had bought as a colt and that Cornelius had trained himself, and he carried with him a Henry rifle, a Colt revolver, and a leather satchel containing what remained of his fortune in bank drafts and gold coin, an amount that felt both enormous and utterly insufficient depending on the hour of the day. He reached Larned on a gray afternoon with rain threatening from the west, and he found the town much as such prairie towns tended to be, a single main street of false-fronted buildings, a grain elevator by the rail spur, a scattering of houses radiating out toward the surrounding farms and ranches. He asked at the general store for Fannie Carter and was directed to a small frame house at the edge of town, white paint peeling from the harsh prairie winters, a garden gone to seed for the season out front. Fannie answered his knock still wearing her teaching clothes, a dark blue dress with a high collar, chalk dust faintly visible on her sleeve where she had erased a slate that afternoon. And for a moment the two of them simply stood looking at each other, she taking in this tall stranger with the weathered coat and the tired, kind eyes, he taking in a woman whose photograph he had not seen, but whose letter he had read so many times he felt he already knew the shape of her thoughts. "Mr. Fletcher," she said finally, and there was such relief and disbelief mingled in her voice that Cornelius felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he had not expected. "I did not truly believe you would come yourself. I could hardly send a letter to do a man's work, Miss Carter," he said, removing his hat. "Tell me about your brother and tell me about this man Voss, and I will do what can be done." She invited him in out of the coming rain, and over coffee at her small kitchen table she told him everything, her voice steady even as her hands trembled around her cup. How Thomas had always been the restless one of the family, how their mother had died bearing him and their father had doted on him perhaps too much in compensation, how he had left for the freight outfit against Fannie's own advice because he wanted, he said, to prove himself a man who did not need his older sister's protection. She told him of Voss's way station, some 30 miles south near a crossing called Bluff Creek, and of the letters Thomas had smuggled out through a sympathetic freighter, each one more desperate than the last, describing beatings for slow work and a debt that Voss's bookkeeping made impossible to escape. Cornelius listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I have done this 3 times now," he said. "Bought a man's debts and forced his release with paper, and when paper failed, with the threat of worse. I will not lie to you and say it is without danger. Men like Voss do not surrender their profits gently. I know I am asking you to risk yourself for a boy you have never met," Fannie said, and here her composure finally cracked, just slightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have no way to repay such a kindness, Mr. Fletcher. I have only this house and my teacher's wages, and neither amounts to much." "I am not asking to be repaid," Cornelius said, and he meant it so plainly that Fannie found herself believing him entirely. "I inherited more money than any one man needs, Miss Carter, and I have decided I would rather spend it undoing wrongs than adding to my own comfort. Your brother's freedom is worth more to me than another parlor rug or a finer breed of cattle." They sat together as the rain finally broke outside, drumming on the roof, and Fannie found herself telling him more than she had intended about her father's death, about the loneliness of the past 3 years, about how teaching the town's children had given her purpose, but not, if she was honest, joy, not the way she imagined joy might feel. Cornelius in turn spoke of his father, of the cold arithmetic of Amos Fletcher's love, of the strange freedom he had felt the day he decided to spend that inheritance on something his father would have called foolish. Neither of them noticed how long they had talked until the lamp needed refilling, and Fannie, embarrassed, insisted he take supper with her before finding a room at the town's small hotel. Over a simple meal of beans and cornbread, made all the finer by conversation, Cornelius found himself laughing for the first time in what felt like a very long while, and Fannie found herself watching his face when he laughed, the way the tiredness in his eyes lifted for just a moment, and thinking that she had not expected the man of the traveling preacher's sermon to be quite so gentle in his manner, nor so quick to smile at her own dry humor. The next morning, Cornelius rode south toward Bluff Creek with a plan already forming, though he insisted Fannie remain in Larned rather than risk herself at the way station. She argued, of course, for she was not a woman inclined to sit idle while her brother's fate hung in the balance, but Cornelius pointed out, gently but firmly, that Voss would use her presence against them, would see in her a hostage to leverage, and that she could better serve Thomas by preparing a place for him to recover once he was free. Bluff Creek Way Station proved a rougher operation than Pruitt's lumber camp, less a fixed camp than a series of corrals and bunkhouses serving the freight road, with Voss himself, a heavy-set man with a face reddened by whiskey and sun, quick to anger and quicker to violence, as Cornelius learned when he arrived to find a teamster being horsewhipped in the yard for the crime of complaining about spoiled meat in the commissary rations. Cornelius did not rush in with money and papers this time, having learned from the Prude affair that a man like Voss needed to feel cornered before he would truly listen. Instead, he spent 2 days in the nearby town of Coldwater, gathering information, learning that Voss's freight contracts with the Army quartermaster at Fort Dodge represented the bulk of his income, and that the Army, whatever its other faults, took a dim view of contractors who ran what amounted to slave labor. For the officers at Fort Dodge included men who had fought a war over precisely that question less than a decade before. Armed with this knowledge, Cornelius rode to Fort Dodge itself and requested an audience with the post commander, a Colonel Whitfield who listened with growing anger as Cornelius described the conditions at Bluff Creek, the debt bondage, the whippings, the trapped teamsters including a 19-year-old boy named Thomas Carter who had done nothing more than seek honest work. Whitfield, it turned out, had no patience for such arrangements tainting his supply lines, and he agreed to send a young lieutenant and a squad of soldiers to accompany Cornelius back to Bluff Creek, ostensibly to inspect the quality of freight service, but in practice to ensure that whatever negotiation followed would happen without gunplay. Voss, faced with an Army lieutenant at his elbow and Cornelius Fletcher's bank drafts on the table, found his options considerably narrowed. He blustered for a time about legitimate debts and legal contracts, but the lieutenant made it clear that continued Army contracts depended on Voss's cooperation, and Voss, whatever his cruelty, was not a stupid man. He accepted $800 for the release of Thomas Carter and 11 other teamsters held on similar false debts, grumbling the entire while that he was being robbed by soft-hearted fools who did not understand how freight business truly worked. Thomas Carter, when Cornelius found him among the freedmen, looked older than his 19 years, his face gaunt, a fading bruise along one cheekbone, but his eyes lit with a fierce and grateful relief when Cornelius told him his sister had sent for help and that he was free to go home. The ride back to Larned took 2 days, and Cornelius used the time to know the boy a little, finding him chastened by his ordeal but not broken, already talking of finding steadier work, perhaps even returning to school as his sister had always wanted for him. When they rode into Larned on a crisp November afternoon, Fannie was standing on her porch as though she had been standing there the entire time they were gone, and when she saw her brother alive and whole atop a borrowed horse beside Cornelius Fletcher, she ran down the porch steps and across the muddy street without any thought for dignity, and gathered Thomas into an embrace so fierce he laughed, and told her she would crack his ribs after Voss had failed to do so with his whip. Cornelius sat his horse a little apart, watching the reunion with a lump in his throat he had not expected, and it was Fannie who broke away from her brother first and came to stand beside Samson's flank, looking up at Cornelius with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life, gratitude so profound it had gone past words into something more like reverence. "I do not know how to thank you," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "You already have," Cornelius said quietly. "You wrote a letter to a stranger, and you trusted him to come." That evening, after Thomas had eaten his fill and fallen into an exhausted sleep in his own bed for the first time in months, Fannie and Cornelius sat together on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the last light fade over the prairie, and something unspoken but undeniable had settled between them, a recognition neither was quite ready to name aloud. "You will move on to the next camp, I suppose," Fannie said. "The next stranger's letter." "I suppose I will," Cornelius admitted, "though I confess I find myself in less of a hurry to leave Larned than I expected." Fannie looked at him sideways, a small smile touching her lips despite the exhaustion of the day's emotions. "The town has a fine schoolhouse in need of repair, and a widow's garden 2 doors down that no one has tended since her husband passed. A man with more money than sense and no particular schedule might find plenty to occupy him here a while longer." Is that an invitation, Miss Carter, or merely an observation of the town's needs? Perhaps a little of both, Mr. Fletcher. He stayed a week, then two, finding reasons that felt legitimate at the time, helping Thomas find work at the grain elevator, seeing to repairs on the schoolhouse roof before winter set in fully, and each evening finding his way back to Fannie's porch or her kitchen table, their conversations stretching longer, their silences growing more comfortable rather than less. He told her more of his father, of the cold ranch house he had grown up in, of a mother who had died when he was 7, and whose memory had softened with time into something he could barely trust as real, a warmth he associated with lavender soap and a voice singing hymns, nothing more concrete than that. She told him of her own mother's death bringing Thomas into the world, of her father's grief that had made him both gentler and more distant, of the books he had left her, the only inheritance that had ever mattered to her. It was on a cold evening in early December, with the first snow of the season dusting the prairie outside, that Cornelius finally spoke what had been building in him since that first afternoon on her porch. They sat by her small stove, Fannie mending a shirt of Thomas's, Cornelius simply watching her hands work, when he said, without quite planning the words in advance, "I received a letter 3 weeks ago from a man in the Cherokee Nation, telling of another camp, this one holding perhaps 30 men on a cotton plantation that never quite let go of the old ways despite the war's ending. I mean to go there after the new year." Fannie's hand stilled on the mending. "I expected as much." "I want you to come with me," he said, and the words surprised him even as he spoke them, though he found he did not want to take them back. "Not to the camps themselves. I would never ask that of you, but westward, wherever this work takes me. I have spent a year now believing that a man could not build a life around such work, that it required a kind of solitude, a willingness to have nothing permanent. I do not believe that any longer, Fannie. I believe I would do this work better, and for longer, with you beside me rather than merely in my thoughts each evening." Fannie set down the mending entirely now, and her eyes, when she looked at him, were bright with an emotion that was not quite tears though close to them. "You are asking me to give up my position here, my house, everything settled in my life, to follow you into danger for the sake of strangers." "I am asking you to marry me," Cornelius said, and there it was, spoken plainly at last. "I love you, Fannie Carter. I believe I began to love you the moment I read your letter before I ever saw your face, and every day since has only confirmed it. I cannot promise you an easy life. I can promise you that I will never ask you to be less than you are, and that whatever I do with what remains of my fortune, I will do it with you as my partner rather than my secret." Fannie was quiet for a long moment, and Cornelius felt his heart pounding in the silence, wondering if he had moved too quickly, if the intensity of the past weeks had led him to mistake gratitude for something deeper on her part. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady and sure in a way that told him she had perhaps been considering this very question for longer than he realized. "I have turned down 2 proposals this year, Cornelius Fletcher, from men who offered me safety and comfort and asked nothing of me, but that I be pleasant and undemanding. I did not love either of them, and I think I knew even as I refused them that I was waiting for something else, though I could not have named what. I did not expect it to arrive on horseback with a satchel full of bank drafts and a habit of freeing men no one else would trouble themselves over." She reached across the small space between them and took his hand in both of hers. "Yes, I will marry you. I will follow you into whatever danger this work requires, because I have watched you face it already for a brother I love more than my own comfort. And I cannot imagine loving a man who did not have that fire in him, even knowing it will not always let us rest easy." They were married in January in the small Methodist church at Larned, with Thomas standing as witness for his sister and Otis Greer, the blacksmith who had first stood with Cornelius at Pruitt's camp, riding up from Preston to stand as witness for the groom. The ceremony was simple, for neither of them had much taste for grandeur, and Fannie wore a dress of soft gray wool rather than white, practical for the winter cold, though she had pinned a small spray of dried prairie flowers to her collar that Thomas had gathered and pressed for her the previous autumn, before his own troubles had begun, a gift he had saved for just such an occasion. The town of Larned, whatever its earlier puzzlement over the schoolteacher's refusals, turned out in force for the wedding, for word of Thomas's rescue had spread, and the town had come to regard Cornelius Fletcher as something between a hero and a curiosity, a rich man who did not act rich, and they were, on the whole, delighted to see their schoolteacher find happiness after years of quiet solitude. The reverend who married them, an elderly circuit preacher named Hollies, remarked in his ceremony that he had rarely seen two people so plainly suited to each other's strengths, one with the courage to act and the other with the wisdom to know when action was needed. And though the words were simple, they struck both Fannie and Cornelius as truer than most wedding sermons managed to be. That night, in the small hotel room they had taken for their wedding night before departing for a longer journey, Cornelius held Fannie close and told her again what he had come to believe with his whole heart, that his father's fortune, however it had been earned through hard bargaining and cold calculation, had found its truest purpose not in the ranch house or the cattle herds, but in this moment, in this marriage. In the freedom it had purchased for men like Thomas and Josiah Bell and dozens of others whose names Cornelius had come to know and would never forget. "Your father would not have understood this," Fannie said softly, her head resting against his chest. "No," Cornelius agreed. "But I think, in the end, I understand it well enough for both of us." They did not linger long in Larned after the wedding, for Fannie insisted that Thomas, now steady in his work at the grain elevator and lodging with a respectable family from the church, no longer needed her constant presence, and that her own restlessness, once she allowed herself to feel it fully, matched her new husband's more than she had expected. They sold Fannie's small house to a young couple newly arrived from Ohio, and Fannie resigned her teaching position with genuine regret but also genuine excitement for what lay ahead. And by the middle of January, the two of them were riding south and east together, toward the Cherokee Nation and the cotton plantation Cornelius had learned of. The journey introduced Fannie to a side of the work she had only imagined from her brother's rescue, and she proved herself far more capable than Cornelius had dared hope, keeping careful ledgers of every dollar spent and every debt purchased, for she had a schoolteacher's precision with numbers and letters both, and she quickly became indispensable to the practical side of the work in a way that freed Cornelius to focus on the negotiations, and when necessary, the harder conversations with men like Prout and Voss, who mistook cruelty for strength. The plantation, called Fairhaven though there was little fair about it, was run by a family named Calloway who had lost their slaves to emancipation, but had found, through the sharecropping and debt systems that flourished in the war's aftermath, a way to keep much the same labor bound to the same land under conditions scarcely improved. The 30 men held there, all of them freedmen who had once been enslaved on that very plantation before the war, worked the cotton fields under a debt system so blatantly unjust that even the local county records, when Cornelius examined them, showed clear evidence of fraud, prices charged for supplies that bore no relation to any honest market rate. This time, rather than relying solely on buying out the debts, Cornelius and Fannie together built a case that could be brought before a federal Freedmen's Bureau agent still stationed in the region, a weary but principled man named Agent Pemberton, who had seen 100 such arrangements and had grown frustrated at how few of them he could actually prosecute for lack of evidence. Fannie's careful documentation of the Calloway family's fraudulent bookkeeping, combined with Cornelius's willingness to fund the legal proceedings, gave Pemberton what he needed to bring formal charges, and though the Calloways fought the matter through the local courts for several months, the eventual judgment freed all 30 men from their debts and awarded several of them back wages besides. It was during this long legal fight, which required Cornelius and Fannie to take up residence for a time in a small rented house near the county seat, that Fannie discovered she was carrying their first child, a discovery that filled her with a joy so profound she wept telling Cornelius the news, and filled Cornelius with a fierce protective love that made him, for the first time since beginning this work, seriously consider whether he ought to continue it at all, given the dangers it sometimes carried. "You will not stop on my account," Fannie told him firmly, sitting across from him at their small kitchen table with her hand resting on her still flat stomach as though she could already feel the life growing there. "I did not marry a man who does nothing, Cornelius Fletcher, and I will not raise our child to believe that safety is worth more than justice. We will simply be more careful. We will choose our fights with wisdom rather than abandoning the fight altogether." Cornelius could not argue with her logic, nor did he particularly want to, for he had come to trust her judgment as much as his own, perhaps more in matters requiring patience and careful strategy rather than pure boldness. Together they agreed to a compromise, that Cornelius would continue the work but would rely more heavily on legal proceedings and less on direct confrontation, using Agent Pemberton's Freedmen's Bureau connections, and, where the Bureau's authority did not reach, hiring lawyers to pursue the same kind of fraud cases that had freed the Fairhaven men. Their daughter, whom they named Sarah after Cornelius's mother, was born in the autumn of 1874, in a small house they had by then purchased outright in the town of Wichita, which had grown enough by that point to offer both a proper doctor and a community that, having heard the stories of Cornelius Fletcher's crusade, welcomed the couple with genuine warmth rather than the suspicion that might have greeted them in a smaller town. Sarah was a healthy, loud child from her very first breath, with her mother's dark hair and, as she grew, her father's pale hazel eyes, and both parents found in her a joy that neither had quite anticipated could exist alongside the harder work of their marriage. The work did not stop, though it slowed for a season while Fannie recovered and the new family found its footing. Cornelius made shorter trips during this time, always returning within a week or two, always writing to Fannie daily even when the trip lasted only a few days, letters that Fannie kept in a wooden box that would, over the years, grow to hold hundreds of such letters, a record of a marriage built as much on words as on the deeper bond between them. By 1876, the Fletcher name had become known throughout the southern plains and into Texas as a name that struck fear into men who profited from bound labor and hope into those who suffered under it. Cornelius had by this point spent nearly the entirety of his father's original fortune, some $40,000 in total across 3 years, on buying out debts, funding legal proceedings, and on occasion simply paying corrupt local officials to look the other way while a camp was dismantled through less official means. What remained was the Wichita house, a small herd of cattle Cornelius kept more from habit than ambition, and the income Fannie earned from a small school she had started for the children of the town's growing population, for she had found she could not entirely give up teaching even amid the demands of motherhood and the ongoing work of freeing strangers. It was in the spring of that year that the hardest trial of their marriage arrived, in the form of a camp, far more dangerous than any Cornelius had previously confronted. Word reached him through Agent Pemberton's network of an operation in the Texas Panhandle, run by a former Confederate colonel named Ashworth who held nearly 60 men, both freedmen and a group of Comanche captives taken in raids that violated even the loose treaties of the time, forcing them to work a combination of cattle ranching and freight hauling under conditions of brutal violence. Ashworth was known to have killed at least 2 men who had tried to escape his camp, and he commanded a force of nearly 20 armed guards, far more than Prout or Voss had ever mustered. Cornelius knew this camp would require more than money and paperwork. It would require allies with real force behind them, and it was here that an unexpected connection proved crucial, For among the Comanche captives held by Ashworth was the nephew of a leader named 10 Bears, an aging but still respected figure among the Comanche who had settled, not entirely peacefully, onto the reservation lands near Fort Sill following years of resistance. Cornelius traveled to Fort Sill, at considerable personal risk given the tensions still raw between settlers and the tribes only recently confined to reservation life, and through an interpreter explained his intentions to 10 Bears directly. 10 Bears, whose own losses in the wars of the previous decade had left him wary of any white man's promises, listened to Cornelius's account with a stern, unreadable face for a long while before finally speaking through the interpreter. "Many white men have promised justice to my people and delivered only more theft," he said. "Why should I believe you are different?" "I cannot promise you I am different in every way," Cornelius answered honestly. "I can promise you that I have already spent 3 years and most of my fortune proving that this particular promise, the freeing of your nephew and the others held with him, is one I intend to keep, with or without your help. But your help would save lives, mine and theirs both, and I would rather not spend those lives needlessly if there is another way." Something in the plain honesty of this answer seemed to reach the old leader, and after a long consultation with several of his warriors, 10 Bears agreed to send a small party of Comanche riders, not to attack Ashworth's camp directly, which risked reigniting exactly the kind of violence the reservation authorities feared, but to position themselves nearby as a show of force while Cornelius and a group of federal marshals, arranged through Agent Pemberton's persistent lobbying of his bureau superiors, approached Ashworth with formal legal authority to inspect and dismantle the camp. Ashworth, faced with federal marshals at his front gate and unmistakable evidence of a substantial Comanche presence in the hills beyond his camp, chose, in the end, not to fight a battle he suspected he would lose, though he did not surrender gracefully, cursing Cornelius as a traitor to his own race and threatening lawsuits that never materialized once the full extent of his fraud and violence came to light in the resulting federal investigation. The 60 men held at his camp were freed. The Comanche captives returned to their families near Fort Sill in a reunion that Cornelius and Fannie both attended, watching 10 Bears embrace his nephew with a fierce, silent emotion that needed no interpreter to understand. It was at this reunion that Cornelius first noticed the deep bond forming between 10 Bears' nephew, a young man named Kicking Bird who had spent nearly 2 years in Ashworth's camp, and one of the freedwomen who had also been held there, a woman named Delilah who had been separated from her own family during the chaos of emancipation years before, and had found, in the shared suffering of the camp, an unexpected companion in Kicking Bird, despite the barriers of language and custom that might have kept them apart in easier circumstances. Fannie, ever perceptive of matters of the heart, remarked to Cornelius that perhaps their own unlikely love, born from a letter between strangers, was not so unusual after all, that hardship and courage had a way of revealing true compatibility that comfortable circumstances often obscured. Cornelius agreed, and though it was not his place to encourage or discourage what grew between Kicking Bird and Delilah, he was glad, in the months that followed, to hear that the two had indeed married, with 10 Bears' blessing, and had settled near the reservation, building a small but steady life together, a reminder that the work Cornelius did rippled outward into forms of happiness he could never have fully anticipated. The Ashworth affair, though successful, had cost Cornelius dearly, both financially and in the toll it took on his nerves, for he had come closer to real violence in that confrontation than in any previous one, and he returned to Wichita afterward more shaken than he let on, at least at first. It was Fannie who noticed the change in him, the nightmares that occasionally disturbed his sleep, the way he sometimes stared too long at nothing in particular when he thought she was not watching. "You cannot carry every man's suffering as though it were your own to bear alone," she told him one evening, after Sarah had been put to bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. "You have freed nearly 150 men and women now, Cornelius, but you are not responsible for every wrong in this territory, and you cannot pour from an empty well." "I know it," Cornelius admitted, "but I think of my father sometimes, of how he built his fortune, and I wonder if I am only now paying back a debt he never acknowledged he owed." "Perhaps you are," Fannie said gently, "but a debt paid is a debt paid, my love. You need not carry the guilt forward forever. At some point, the ledger balances, and you are allowed to simply live." Her words settled into him slowly over the following weeks, and Cornelius found himself, for the first time since his father's death, beginning to think about what a life beyond this singular mission might look like. Not an abandonment of the principle that had driven him, but perhaps a broadening of it, a way to continue the work without it consuming every part of him. The opportunity to find that balance came, unexpectedly, through Agent Pemberton, who had grown so impressed with the Fletcher family's methodical approach to documenting fraud and pursuing legal remedies that he suggested Cornelius consider formalizing the work, establishing a small legal aid office that could pursue such cases on an ongoing basis, without requiring Cornelius himself to ride into every dangerous camp personally. Cornelius was initially resistant to the idea, feeling that the personal risk and personal presence were essential to the work's integrity. But Fannie, with her schoolteacher's practical mind, saw the wisdom in it immediately. "You cannot ride into every camp forever," she pointed out. "You have a daughter now and, God willing, more children to come. But if you train other men, honest lawyers and agents who share your convictions, the work can continue and even grow beyond what one man alone could accomplish, long after you have hung up your saddle for good." It took most of a year to establish, but by 1878 the Fletcher Legal Aid Society, as it came to be modestly named, had opened a small office in Wichita staffed by two young lawyers Cornelius had personally vetted for their character as much as their competence, along with a network of correspondents, freedmen and sympathetic settlers alike, scattered across Kansas, the Indian Territory, and northern Texas, who reported new instances of debt bondage and labor fraud as they arose. Cornelius funded the operation with the last significant remainder of his inheritance, some $6,000, but he also began, for the first time in years, to actually build income again, investing carefully in cattle and in a small share of the Wichita Rail Depot, understanding now that sustainable work required a sustainable foundation rather than the reckless spending of his early crusading years. Fannie, meanwhile, expanded her own school into a proper institution, eventually earning a small salary from the growing town that allowed her, in turn, to fund scholarships for the children of freedmen families who had been helped by her husband's work, a fitting symmetry that neither of them had planned but both came to cherish deeply. Their family grew alongside their work. In 1877, Fannie gave birth to their second child, a son they named Amos, not without some hesitation on Cornelius's part given his complicated feelings toward his own father. But Fannie had insisted that the name itself was not tainted, only the choices the elder Amos had made, and that their son might grow to redeem the name in ways his grandfather never had. Cornelius found, watching his infant son grow into a sturdy, curious toddler over the following years, that he came to feel a genuine tenderness toward the name after all, a sense that perhaps forgiveness, even for the dead, was possible when love was strong enough to hold it. A third child followed in 1879, a daughter they named Ruth, born in the depth of a particularly harsh winter that tested the young family's resilience, but ultimately only deepened the bond between them. For Cornelius spent that entire winter close to home, tending the fire, reading to Sarah and young Amos by lamplight while Fannie recovered her strength, and finding in those quiet domestic months a happiness every bit as profound as anything he had felt freeing a camp of desperate men. It was not that the dangerous work entirely ceased. Even with the Legal Aid Society handling much of the routine casework, there remained occasions requiring Cornelius's personal involvement, particularly cases where violence seemed likely, and his particular combination of resources and reputation could diffuse a situation before it turned deadly. One such case arose in 1880, when word reached the society of a particularly brutal camp near the Cimarron River, run by a man named Coulter who had grown bold enough to attempt to seize free settlers, luring destitute travelers with false promises of work, and then holding them through manufactured debts in a scheme more elaborate and more dangerous than anything Cornelius had previously encountered. Cornelius rode to the Cimarron camp with two of the Legal Aid Society's young lawyers, and at Fannie's insistence, a Pinkerton detective the society had begun retaining for particularly dangerous cases, a hard, capable woman named Agnes Doyle, who had earned her reputation working fraud cases across the territory, and who proved, in the confrontation with Coulter, every bit as steady under pressure as any of the men Cornelius had previously relied upon. Coulter, faced with the combined weight of legal documentation, an armed and capable investigator, and Cornelius's now considerable reputation for following through on his threats of legal and financial ruin, chose to flee the territory entirely rather than face the consequences of his scheme unraveling, and the 11 settlers he had trapped were freed without a shot fired. Cornelius returned from the Cimarron affair to find Fannie waiting on the porch of their now comfortable Wichita house, Sarah, now 6 years old, running down the steps to greet him with the fierce, uncomplicated joy of a child who had grown up understanding, in her own way, that her father's work mattered even when it took him away for weeks at a time. Amos toddled behind his sister, and baby Ruth watched from Fannie's arms with the solemn curiosity of an infant taking in a world still mostly new to her. "Another camp dismantled," Fannie said, coming down to meet him as he dismounted from Samson, the same gelding, now aging but still faithful, that had carried him on that very first ride to Preston 7 years before. "How many now all told?" "Agent Pemberton's last count had it at just over 230, Cornelius said, gathering Sarah up into his arms as she reached him. "Though I confess I have lost precise track myself these past 2 years. 230 souls, Fannie said softly, shaking her head with something between wonder and pride. "Your father left you a fortune, Cornelius, and you turned it into something far greater than money." "I turned it into you," Cornelius said, reaching for her hand once Sarah had wriggled down to chase after her younger brother across the yard. "Into this family, this life. Whatever good I have done for strangers, I think the greatest gift my father's money ever purchased was that letter reaching me at just the right moment and finding you at the other end of it." Fannie leaned into him, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the yard of their home, watching their children play in the golden light of a Kansas evening, the work of the day settled, the work of the years ahead still stretching before them but no longer frightening in its uncertainty, for they had built something together sturdy enough to weather whatever came. The years that followed brought their share of both hardship and joy, as all lives do. In 1882, a diphtheria outbreak swept through Wichita, and though their own children survived it, several of Fannie's students did not, a grief that settled heavily over the whole family for a long season, and that Cornelius, drawing on his own experience with loss, helped Fannie carry through the long nights of mourning that followed. In 1884, the Legal Aid Society faced its greatest legal challenge when a coalition of Texas ranchers, tired of losing cheap labor to Cornelius's interventions, attempted to have the society's charter revoked through political pressure in the state legislature, a fight that took nearly a year of careful maneuvering and testimony before Congress's own investigators, drawn to the matter by growing national attention to the persistence of debt peonage in the years following Reconstruction, ultimately vindicated the society's work and even led to stronger federal statutes against such practices, statutes that would, decades later, form part of the legal foundation used to finally outlaw debt. Peonage entirely under federal law. Thomas Carter, Fannie's brother whose rescue had begun the entire chain of events leading to this life, married in 1881, a young woman from Larne named Clara Ives, and the two of them eventually took over management of a portion of the cattle interests Cornelius still maintained, giving Thomas the steady, respectable life he had always wanted to prove himself capable of building. He and Cornelius remained close throughout the years, Thomas often saying that he owed his brother-in-law not only his freedom, but his very sister's happiness, a debt he considered far greater than the one Voss had once tried to claim against him. By 1885, the Fletcher family had grown to 5 children, with the addition of twin boys, David and Jonah, born in 1883, whose arrival had thrown the household into a chaos of diapers and sleepless nights that both parents, despite the exhaustion, treasured as proof of how full their lives had become from such uncertain beginnings. Cornelius, now nearing 40, had settled into a role less of dramatic rescuer and more of quiet, steady advocate, spending his days managing the Legal Aid Society's growing casework, his evenings with his family, occasionally still riding out personally when a case demanded his particular touch, but no longer needing to be the singular force behind every rescue. For he had, in Fannie's words, built something that would outlast any single man's efforts. It was on a warm evening in the spring of 1886, with their 5 children variously occupied around the comfortable house they had built on the outskirts of Wichita, that Cornelius and Fannie sat together on the same style of porch where he had first proposed to her 13 years before, watching the sun set over land that had, in that time, transformed from raw frontier into something approaching settled civilization, the railroad now crisscrossing the plains in every direction. Towns grown into small cities, the worst of the old lawlessness receding even as new forms of injustice continued to require vigilance. "Do you ever regret it?" Fannie asked him, as she sometimes did on quiet evenings like this one, though she asked not from doubt but from a genuine curiosity about how her husband's heart had settled over the years. "Spending it all, I mean. Your father's entire fortune, gone to strangers who could never repay you." Cornelius considered the question with the same seriousness he had always given it, though his answer, by now, came easily. "I think of my father sometimes, still, and I wonder what he would say if he could see this porch, these children, this life. He built his fortune believing that wealth was the only measure of a man's success, and I spent that fortune proving him wrong, that a man's true wealth is measured in the lives he touches, the wrongs he rights, the family he builds along the way. I do not regret a single dollar of it, Fannie. Every camp I dismantled, every man and woman freed, every dollar spent, led me eventually to you, to Sarah and Amos and Ruth and David and Jonah, to this porch and this sunset and this life I could never have imagined for myself the day I buried my father." Fannie reached for his hand, as she had done so many times over the years, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded over the Kansas plains, the sound of their children's laughter drifting from the yard where Sarah, now 12, was teaching her younger siblings some game of her own invention, a peaceful, ordinary moment that neither of them took for granted, knowing as they did how easily such peace could be denied to those less fortunate, and how much work and sacrifice it had taken to build even this small measure of it for their own family, and for the hundreds of strangers whose lives Cornelius's inheritance had touched along the way. The Legal Aid Society continued its work for decades after, eventually merging with larger civil rights organizations in the early years of the new century. Its founding principle, that no man's freedom should be bought and sold through fraudulent debt, becoming enshrined more firmly in law with each passing year, though the fight against such injustices, as Cornelius often reminded his children when they grew old enough to understand his history, was never truly finished. only ever carried forward by each generation willing to take up the work. Cornelius Fletcher lived to see his children grown, his grandchildren born, and the century turn into a new one, still holding Fannie's hand on evenings much like that spring evening in 1886. The fire of his youth mellowed into a steady, enduring warmth that had, in the end, proven far more powerful than the cold calculation of his father's ledger books ever could have been. He died peacefully in 1919 at the age of 72, in the same Wichita house where his children had grown, with Fannie beside him, and his last words, as she would tell their grandchildren for years afterward, were simply, "It was worth every dollar." Fannie outlived him by 6 years, spending that time surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward, in ways large and small, the legacy of a fortune spent not on comfort but on freedom, and of a love that had begun with a desperate letter from a stranger and had grown, through courage and sacrifice and an unshakable commitment to justice, into a life neither of them could have imagined that first gray afternoon in Larned, when a tired writer had knocked on a schoolteacher's door and asked simply how he might help.